There are moments in this world that arrive without warning, moments that do not give you time to prepare. Do not knock before entering. Do not ask whether you are ready. They simply happen, quiet and enormous, like a door swinging open in a room you believed was sealed shut. And on the morning of October 19th, 1974, in Griffith Park, Los Angeles, such a moment arrived, wrapped in the sound of a cracked guitar and the voice of a boy who was running out of time. The crowd had gathered slowly, the way crowds always do around something they cannot yet explain. First, one person stopped walking, then 3, then 20, then close to 40 people stood in a loose, breathless circle on the gravel path beneath the old oak trees. And not one of them could have told you exactly why their feet refused to move. There was something in the sound coming from the center of that circle, something that reached inside your chest without asking permission and simply held on. At the center of that circle sat Eddie Reyes, 11 years old, a blue bandana wrapped tight around his bald head, a cracked acoustic guitar balanced across his thin lap, one tuning peg missing, 2 strings replaced with fishing line. His eyes were closed, his chin lifted slightly toward the pale morning light filtering through the trees, and his fingers, steady in a way that made no sense given how small and hollow the rest of him appeared, moved through the opening chords of My Sweet Lord. For a moment, no one moved. Then a heavy-set park security guard named Mr. Briggs stepped into the circle with a clipboard and a hard expression, and the spell began to crack. What no one in that crowd had noticed was the car that had quietly pulled to a stop on the park road behind them. They did not hear the door open. They did not see the thin, dark-haired man in the worn leather jacket standing now at the very edge of the circle, completely still, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed on the boy in the wheelchair. Nobody knew his name yet. Nobody knew what he was carrying inside him that morning or what this song was about to unlock. But what this man was about to do would change Eddie Reyes's life forever and remind the entire world what music is actually for. 6 months before that October morning, Eddie Reyes had been the kind of boy who never stopped moving. He was the son of Rosa and Miguel Reyes, Mexican immigrants who ran a small laundry on Cesar Chavez Avenue in East Los Angeles. Miguel worked the early shift at a warehouse in Vernon and came home smelling of machine oil and exhaustion. Rosa washed and pressed other people's clothes from 6 in the morning until her hands cracked and bled. They had very little, but they had Eddie, and for a long time, that had been more than enough. Eddie played pickup baseball in the alley behind the laundry. He built model planes from kits he found at the thrift store and hung them from his bedroom ceiling with fishing line. And 6 months ago, his uncle had brought him a battered Yamaha FG-180 acoustic guitar, 1 tuning peg missing, a crack running along the lower body, 2 strings replaced with fishing line because real guitar strings cost money the family didn't have. Eddie had never taken a single lesson. He had simply picked it up, listened, and figured it out. That was the kind of boy he was, the kind who figured things out. Then the headache started, then the bruising that wouldn't heal. Then came the morning in April 1974, when a doctor sat Rosa and Miguel down in a small room at County General Hospital and said the word that turned their world to ash. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. A cancer that moved fast in children, the doctor said. Treatment existed, but the cost was staggering, and the Reyes family had no insurance. Eddie learned the truth by accident. He heard his parents whispering in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, thinking he was asleep, their voices low and broken. He never told them he knew. He never cried about it in front of them. Instead, 3 weeks later, he asked Rosa to wheel him to Griffith Park on a Saturday morning. Just for air, he told her. Just to sit outside for a while. The first Saturday, he made $4.75. The second Saturday, he made $11. And the song that made people stop, always without fail, was My Sweet Lord. He had heard it drifting from a radio in the hospital waiting room, and something in it had reached inside his chest and refused to let go. He didn't fully understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was a song about needing something you couldn't see, about asking for help from the only place you had left. He had no idea that the man who wrote that prayer was at that very same moment in desperate need of the same thing. George Harrison, in October of 1974, was by every visible measure a man who had everything. The Beatles were behind him. His triple album, All Things Must Pass, had stunned the world. My Sweet Lord had reached #1 across the globe. He had a sprawling estate in Henley-on-Thames, the respect of every serious musician alive, and a level of creative freedom that most artists only ever dreamed about. From the outside, George Harrison looked like a man standing at the top of the world. But the outside, as it almost always does, was lying. The Dark Horse North American Tour, his first solo tour, the one his entire team had spent months building, was weeks away from launch, and George's voice was gone. Not weakened, not strained, gone. Vocal nodules had formed on his cords from months of overwork, reducing his singing voice to a raw, cracked whisper that bore almost no resemblance to the instrument that had once filled arenas. Rehearsals in Burbank had been painful to witness. The band kept their eyes on the floor. His manager said all the right things. George heard none of them. And then there was the lawsuit. My Sweet Lord, the song he had written as the most private prayer of his life, his reaching toward God after the noise and chaos of Beatlemania had nearly swallowed him whole, was being pulled apart in a courtroom. Lawyers were arguing about chord progressions and melodic similarity. The psalm that had meant everything to him had been turned into a legal exhibit. It felt like watching someone dismantle a cathedral to argue about the bricks. On the morning of October 19th, Harrison left a rehearsal in Burbank that had ended in silence. His voice had cracked on the second verse. He told his driver to take the long way. He needed air. He needed to remember why any of this had ever mattered in the first place. Meanwhile, back in Griffith Park, this was not the first Saturday that Briggs had come for Eddie. He had appeared the second week with his clipboard and his rules. He had hovered on the third week, watching from 15 feet away, with an expression designed to intimidate. By the fifth Saturday, this Saturday, he had decided that patience was finished. A food vendor nearby had complained. Rules were rules. Briggs stepped into the circle, pointed his finger, and called Eddie's playing a disturbance. The crowd pushed back. Voices rose. But Briggs had a badge, and a badge has a way of silencing goodwill faster than anything else in this world. Eddie's fingers found the opening chord anyway. The first notes of My Sweet Lord rose quietly through the October air. And through the open window of a car idling on the park road, George Harrison heard something that made him grab the door handle and say 3 words he hadn't meant to say to anyone that morning. Pull over, now. He moved through the crowd without announcing himself. No gesture, no smile, no acknowledgement of the eyes that were beginning to turn toward him. George Harrison walked the way a man walks when he is not performing, quietly, deliberately, as though the ground beneath him required careful attention. He stopped when he reached the inner edge of the circle, 3 feet behind Briggs, and for 1 full second he simply looked at the boy in the wheelchair. Then he spoke. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Briggs turned around slowly, the way men with clipboards turn when they are certain the interruption will be insignificant. The words he had prepared died somewhere between his brain and his mouth. The crowd had already begun to shift, that particular ripple that moved through a group of people when recognition travels from one person to the next, like a current through water. First, a woman near the left side of the circle pressed her hand to her lips. Then a teenage boy grabbed his friend's sleeve. Then the murmuring began, low and electric, spreading outward until the entire circle was humming with it. Briggs took 1 step backward. Harrison did not look at him again. Eddie was staring up at him with those calm, ancient brown eyes. The eyes of a boy who had spent 6 months learning to absorb things that should have broken him entirely. He did not recognize the face. He had never seen a photograph. He had never owned a record. He simply saw a thin man with tired eyes and a worn leather jacket who had just stepped between him and the man who was about to take his guitar. And in Eddie's world, that was more than enough reason to trust someone. Harrison crouched down beside the wheelchair until he was at eye level. His knees pressed into the cold gravel. He looked at the guitar, the cracked Yamaha body held together with electrical tape, the missing tuning peg, the fishing line strings, and something moved across his face that had nothing to do with pity. It was the expression of a man who has just seen something he recognizes from a long time ago, something honest in a world that had recently felt like nothing but performance. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eddie. Eddie. I'm George." He paused, his eyes still on the guitar. "That song you were playing, where did you learn it?" "Hospital waiting room," Eddie said. "The radio." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "You play it differently than I wrote it." Eddie's face tightened slightly. "Is that bad?" "No," Harrison said. "It's better." He sat down cross-legged on the gravel path, right there, in front of 40 strangers, in the middle of a public park, and held out his hand. Someone in the crowd passed forward a battered chord guitar that a busker 20 yards away had been convinced, very quickly, to lend. Harrison settled it across his knee, adjusted his fingers without looking down, and glanced up at Eddie. "Play it again," he said. "From the beginning. I'll follow you." Rosa Reyes stood at the edge of the circle, with both hands pressed over her mouth, and tears running silently down her face. His fingers found the first chord, and George Harrison, the man who had written "My Sweet Lord" as a private prayer in the ruins of the most famous band in human history, played it back to the boy who had been using it to pray for his own life. What happened in the next 4 minutes stopped traffic on the park road. 3 people in that crowd later said they began crying before they even understood why. A park ranger who had arrived to investigate the size of the gathering stood at the back and never once reached for his radio. And when the last note finally faded into the October air, George Harrison did something that had nothing to do with music, something nobody in that crowd had anticipated. And the silence that followed was the most complete silence that Park had ever held. The applause started slowly. 1 person, then 5, then the entire circle, and then the people beyond the circle who had drifted over from the walking paths and the picnic tables and the parking lot without fully understanding what was drawing them. By the time the last note of "My Sweet Lord" dissolved into the October morning, there were nearly 100 people standing in Griffith Park, watching a man in a leather jacket and a boy in a wheelchair sit together on a gravel path in complete silence. The sound of that applause moved through the trees and carried down the road, and people who heard it later said it didn't sound like applause at all. It sounded like relief. Harrison stood slowly. He brushed the gravel from his jacket with quiet, unhurried hands. Then he turned away from the crowd entirely and walked directly to Rosa Reyes. He did not perform this moment. He did not raise his voice so the people behind him could hear. He simply stood in front of a small, exhausted woman with cracked hands and tear-streaked cheeks and said, "Tell me what he needs." Rosa told him everything. The diagnosis, the cost of treatment, the 6 Saturdays in the park, the $4.75 on the first morning, and the way Eddie had never once complained, never once let her see him afraid. She spoke quietly and without self-pity, the way people speak when they have been carrying something enormous for so long that the weight has simply become part of how they stand. Harrison listened without moving. When she finished, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. He turned it over and wrote a name and a number on the back in careful, deliberate letters. "Call this number Monday morning," he said. "Ask for Richard. Tell him George sent you. Eddie's treatment will be covered. All of it." Rosa stared at the card. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "We cannot accept—" "You're not accepting charity," Harrison said. "You're letting me do something useful with what I have. That is a different thing entirely." Then he turned back to Eddie. He lifted the cracked Yamaha gently from the boy's lap and turned it over in his hands, examining the tape along the body, the missing peg, the fishing line strings. Patricia Chen, the nurse from County General who had told people about Eddie and what he was doing in the park, produced a marker from her bag without being asked. Harrison took it, steadied the guitar across his knee, and signed the lower body in slow, deliberate strokes. George Harrison, Griffith Park, October 19, 1974, My Sweet Lord. He handed it back to Eddie and looked at him with the full weight of everything that morning had cost him to feel. The guitar that plays with that kind of reason behind it, he said quietly, is not a broken guitar. It is the most important guitar I have heard in 20 years. Stay with us, because what George Harrison did 3 weeks later, inside a recording studio in Hollywood, is the part of this story the world has never heard. 3 weeks later, Eddie Reyes sat in the back seat of a car he had never ridden in before, wearing a clean shirt his mother had pressed twice that morning, the signed Yamaha resting across his lap like something sacred. The car pulled up to a building on Santa Monica Boulevard in Hollywood, and when the door opened, Eddie rolled his wheelchair through the entrance of a recording studio for the first time in his life. Harrison was already inside. He was standing in the center of the live room with his own acoustic guitar hanging from his shoulder. And when Eddie came through the door, he smiled the way a man smiles when something he has been quietly hoping for has quietly arrived. I thought, Harrison said, that you and I might finish what we started in the park. They recorded My Sweet Lord together, just the two of them, acoustic, no orchestra, no production, no audience. Eddie's voice was thin but absolutely true. Harrison sang beside him in the cracked whisper the nodules had left him with. And somehow, impossibly, it was the most honest his voice had sounded in months. The recording engineers later said they couldn't explain what happened in that room. One of them spent the final take staring at the floor with his jaw tight, blinking. When it ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Harrison had the session pressed onto a single vinyl acetate, one copy, no duplicates, and sent it to Rosa Reyes the following week with a handwritten note tucked inside the sleeve. When he grows up, he will understand what he gave me that morning in the park. He gave me back my reason. Rosa read the note standing at the kitchen table. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside the sleeve beside the record, and held both against her chest for a very long time. Eddie kept that record for the rest of his life. But there is one final chapter of this story, what Eddie did on the morning of November 29th, 2001, that will leave you absolutely silent. Eddie Reyes survived. The treatment worked. By 1976, he was in remission, back in school in East Los Angeles, the signed Yamaha hanging on his bedroom wall above his desk in a place of honor that his model planes no longer occupied. He grew up. He became a music teacher at an elementary school in Boyle Heights and taught there for 31 years. He told his students the story every single year exactly as it happened, without embellishment, because the truth was already more than enough. He kept the vinyl acetate in a fireproof safe beneath his bed. On the morning of November 29th, 2001, Eddie heard on the car radio that George Harrison had died, brain cancer, 58 years old. He pulled his car to the side of the road and sat for a long time without moving. Then he drove to school, walked into his empty classroom before the students arrived, and took the signed Yamaha down from the wall where he had hung it every year for 27 years. He sat down in front of 30 empty chairs and played My Sweet Lord one final time, alone, quietly, stubbornly. The way he had played it in the park the first time, like a candle refusing the wind. His students arrived to find him there. They sat down without being told, the way children do when they sense that something true is in the room. When the last note faded, one boy raised his hand. "Who is that song for?" Eddie looked up slowly. "For a man," he said, "who got out of a car when he didn't have to, who sat on the ground when he didn't have to, and who listened when the whole world had forgotten how." If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that one act of kindness can change everything. And subscribe, because every week we bring you the moments history almost forgot.